I'm Sienna Quade. I'm 24 years old, and I work as a legal assistant at a small law office in Portland. It's not glamorous, and no one's writing articles about my success, but it's stable, honest work. I've always been the quiet one, the one who makes space so others can take center stage, especially Rylan, my older brother by 3 years, my parents' favorite since the day he was born. To them, Rylan was brilliance incarnate. He got the big cake, the applause, the framed diplomas. I got silence. He failed upward while I learned how to fade into furniture. It didn't bother me, not really. Not until the day everything crashed. Literally. We were driving home from Dad's birthday dinner. I had offered to be the designated driver because, as usual, Rylan was tipsy, and I was invisible enough to be volunteered without asking. The rain had started minutes before we got on the freeway. He was laughing at something on his phone, and I remember staring straight ahead, hands at 10 and 2, thinking about the case files I had to organize the next morning. That's when the truck hit us. It barreled through the divider, its headlights burning straight into my lane and then into my side of the car. I didn't even have time to scream. All I remember is the screech of metal, the smell of smoke, and the deafening silence that followed. And just before it all went dark, a voice, my mother's, echoing from some deep, buried memory. Sienna's always been the burden. When I opened my eyes again, the lights were too bright. The room smelled like plastic and bleach. My mouth was dry, and everything in my body ached. I was wrapped in gauze and wires, and every breath felt like swallowing fire. I tried to speak. Nothing came out. A shadow moved at the edge of my vision. My mother's voice, hushed but sharp, cut through the silence. If we take part of her liver, she said to someone I couldn't see, would it be enough to save Rylan? My body froze. She didn't know I was conscious. They all thought I was sedated, lost in tubes and monitors. But I was there. I was listening. And in that moment, I knew the truth. They would sacrifice me without a second thought. They already had. I wasn't their daughter. I was a spare part, a walking backup plan, a vessel to save the one they truly loved. And now, with Rylan clinging to life, they were ready to cash in. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was the moment I woke up not just in body, but in truth. I didn't misunderstand. I didn't mishear. They truly meant it. If I had to die for Rylan to live, they would let it happen. The days that followed were a blur of pain and quiet dread. I stayed still in that bed, surrounded by white walls and soft beeping machines, not just because I was healing, but because I was afraid to move. Every sound outside my door made my heart race. Every time the handle turned, I braced for their voices, for more talk about what else they could take from me. But they didn't come, not with flowers, not with a hand to hold. They came with questions for the doctors. They didn't ask if I was in pain. They didn't check if I could eat or breathe on my own. Instead, I overheard my mother speaking with a social worker at the nurse's station, her voice low but pointed. Does she have a medical proxy in place, just in case she can't make decisions for herself? She asked, as if planning ahead for my silence. And then, if something happens to her, does her brother have priority for transplant? I stared at the ceiling, blinking away tears that wouldn't fall. I was alive, awake, present, and yet they spoke about me like I was a body being processed, not a daughter recovering from near death. On the third day, a billing representative from the hospital came in with some forms. She mentioned something in passing about updating insurance records. Something about my listed beneficiary. I asked, with a trembling voice, who it was. She checked. Margaret Quade, she said, smiling as if it were a good thing. My mother? I hadn't changed my paperwork. I never thought I'd need to. But now I realized if I had died in that crash, or on the table, the payout would have gone to her. It still would. Later that night, unable to sleep, I stared out the dark window. The city lights flickered far below, but the shadows inside me felt heavier. Then I heard it again. Voices just outside my room, muffled but unmistakably theirs. My mother's voice. If we remove 60% of her liver, will that regenerate fast enough for her to survive? A pause? She's not contributing to the household. I mean, what future does she even have? She files papers in a corner office. Rylan was on track for med school before the DUI thing. Med school. He dropped out after 2 semesters. The DUI was hushed up with a donation from my father. But to her, none of that mattered. She's just extra. She's always been. I didn't cry. My body was too sore, and my mind was too numb. But something inside me cracked, slow and deep like ice under strain. The next morning, the nurse on rotation left her work phone on my tray by accident. I saw it blinking recording icons, still active from a previous memo. I looked at it for a long time before my fingers moved. I pressed save, and then I started using it. Each time they came by, I pressed record. When my mother asked about surgical consent forms, I recorded it. When my father asked about recovery windows and if there would be long-term damage if she donated more than half, I recorded that too. I wasn't paranoid. I was gathering proof. No one was protecting me, so I had to do it myself. The worst moment came on the 5th night. I had finally fallen asleep, a heavy, medicated kind of rest, when a commotion in the hallway woke me. My mother's voice again, this time angrier, more impatient. We need a decision. My son is deteriorating while she just lays there. If she doesn't want to give, then maybe she shouldn't have survived that crash at all. That was the moment I realized something painful. Something I had refused to admit all these years. They had never truly loved me. They loved what I could do for Rylan. They loved the way I stayed quiet, the way I paid for my own textbooks while they saved every cent for his potential. Now that he needed more than money, they turned to me again. Not for comfort, not for connection, but for parts. I stopped looking at the door after that, stopped hoping they'd walk in and finally see me. Instead, I began planning. If they were going to strip me of everything, even my name, even my body, then I would at least leave with the one thing they never truly gave me a voice. And I would use it, not to scream, not to beg, but to expose them. Because when your family becomes your biggest threat, you stop playing the role they wrote for you and start writing your own ending. I knew I had reached the end of what silence could protect. Gathering recordings wasn't enough. If I stayed, they would find a way to convince someone I was unstable, confused, or worse, compliant. I had to leave, and I had to do it before they tried again. The next morning, I asked to speak with the hospital social worker. Not just any casual visit, I requested a formal session and refused to let my parents be present. Her name was Amira Calder, a woman with soft eyes and a sharp mind. She came in quietly, clipboard in hand, her posture neutral but attentive. "I need to be separated from them legally," I said, voice trembling. "I have recordings. They're trying to take my liver, without my consent." She didn't flinch. Instead, she calmly closed the door and sat across from my bed. "Do you feel unsafe?" she asked. "Yes," I whispered. Not just unsafe, unwanted, replaceable. She took the phone from my hand, the one I'd used to record every whispered threat, and listened to the first clip. Then the second. Her jaw tightened, just barely. But her voice remained steady. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "We'll take care of this." Within the hour, a quiet storm began brewing. My room was assigned a security detail. My parents' visitation rights were suspended pending investigation. Amira filed an emergency protective order, citing medical coercion and emotional abuse. Later that evening, I heard it shouting from down the hall. My mother's voice, shrill and cracking. "She's turning on her own blood. She's lying. That girl has always been difficult. This is her way of punishing us." The sound of her heels striking the tile floor grew louder until a security guard stepped in. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to leave the premises," he said. She's my daughter. Not anymore, I whispered to myself. Not if it means dying to prove it. By midnight, Amira returned with a woman named Lorna Fields, a legal advocate for medical abuse survivors. She was calm, methodical, and handed me a packet of paperwork with care. We've arranged for you to be discharged under protective transition. We'll get you to a safe place. I didn't even have shoes, just hospital socks and a thin coat someone had left folded on the chair. My hands shook as I signed each form, initials like anchors on every page. By 2 a.m., I was wheeled out a side entrance, escorted by Lorna and a hospital security officer. No cameras, no ceremony. Just a plastic bag holding my discharge documents, my phone, and my silver locket one my aunt had given me before she passed, the only adult who ever said I reminded her of someone strong. The city air was sharp and unfamiliar. Every street lamp we passed flickered like it knew I was somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. Lorna dropped me off at a women's transitional shelter just outside the industrial district. It was a pale yellow building with peeling paint and bars on the windows, but inside, it smelled like warm rice and cleaning products. And for the first time in weeks, I wasn't afraid. They gave me a twin bed in a shared room and a locker with a dented key. My roommate, Dahlia, was already asleep. I crawled under the thin blanket and stared at the ceiling, the rhythm of a stranger's snoring oddly comforting. I didn't cry. I didn't pray. I just breathed deep, steady, deliberate. I was out. 2 days later, I applied for a job at a nearby freight company night shift inventory clerk. The manager didn't ask about my past, only if I could lift boxes and stay awake until 4 a.m. I said yes. He handed me a badge and a key to the staff locker room. Every night after that, I walked the silent aisles of the warehouse, scanning barcodes, stacking crates, listening to forklifts hum in the distance. It was numb work, but it kept my mind from drifting to things I couldn't afford to feel not yet. During breaks, I sat with my locket in hand and my phone in the other, looking up online paralegal certification programs. I'd given up law school years ago, when my parents said, Rylan has more potential, let him go first. I let him. I always let him. Not anymore. I enrolled that same week. Remote learning, flexible hours. I paid the registration fee with my first 2 paychecks. It felt like rebellion and redemption all at once. No one at the shelter asked about my scar. No one cared where I came from. They cared only that I cleaned up after myself and didn't take more than my share. It was the kind of equality I had never known. I still had nightmares. Sometimes I'd wake up choking on my own breath, my mother's voice still echoing. She's just extra. But I had something now I never had before, a door that locked from the inside, and a future I was building with my own hands. And no matter how small it was mine. It started in the warehouse, somewhere between the two of silence and the soft click of scanners echoing in my ears. Each night shift I survived wasn't just a job, it was a quiet resistance. I used every moment of stillness to study legal codes, precedent cases, ethics modules. I watched videos on trial procedures with tired eyes and shaking fingers. And slowly, the fog of who they told me I was began to lift. Within 18 months, I passed the bar exam with one of the highest scores in my district. No one from my past was there to clap. But my mentor from the shelter, Lorna Fields, sent a voice note saying she'd never seen someone burn so quietly and rise so completely. The morning after I got my certification, I sat alone in a coffee shop, breathing in the smell of ground beans and faint vanilla, and filled out paperwork to legally change my name. I chose Calla Renner, Calla, like the lilies my aunt used to grow. Renner, from a novel I loved as a child, the name of a survivor who rebuilt herself from ruin. I signed the documents with a steady hand and didn't look back. The surname Quade belonged to people who only valued me when I was unconscious. Through a community connection, I joined a small but rapidly growing legal tech startup specializing in advocacy for patients at risk of medical coercion. It was the perfect irony, helping others protect their bodily autonomy. When mine had once been treated like an organ donor form waiting for a signature, I started as a research assistant, filing paperwork and combing through policy drafts. But I read faster than the others. I saw loopholes they didn't. When a junior attorney couldn't argue a case clearly, I rewrote their briefs in silence and passed them forward anonymously. The CEO noticed. 3 years in, I was offered a seat on the startup's executive board as chief policy strategist. By then, I'd stopped flinching at my own reflection, stopped checking doors twice, stopped needing anyone's permission to breathe. One Tuesday afternoon, while reviewing intake forms for new hires, an email popped up on my screen. The subject line read Executive Applicant, Legal Operations. The name below it made my fingers freeze over the keyboard. Rylan Quade. I stared at the name, heart steady but breath slow. It had been 4 years. 4 years since the accident. 4 years since he let them try to carve my body for his survival. I clicked on the attached resume. It was hollow buzzwords stacked over thin experience. He'd bounced between startups, most of which folded. His listed responsibilities were vague, the kind you write when you hope no one checks. His cover letter, however, was startling in its tone. I've made mistakes. It said, I once had a sister. She was brilliant. I didn't see it then. I wish I had. I read it 3 times. Then I forwarded the application to our hiring coordinator. Schedule him for an interview. I'll take it. The next day, I pulled out the USB drive I'd kept locked in my desk drawer all these years. I hadn't listened to it in a long time, but I knew every word. I knew where my mother's voice would crack when she said, "She's not important. Just extra." I knew where my father asked, "What's the survival rate if we just take it all?" That night, I stayed late at the office. The sun dipped behind the city skyline, casting gold onto the glass walls of my office as I prepared 2 mugs of coffee and placed the USB in the center of the table. When Rylan arrived the next morning, he looked tired, older. The arrogance that used to buzz around him like static had dulled. He wore a suit 2 sizes too big and carried a briefcase with a broken clasp. He didn't recognize me at first. Until I looked up, his face paled, mouth parting in disbelief. He started. "I'm alive," I said calmly, "and I remember everything." He sat down slowly, unsure whether to speak or apologize or run. I didn't hand him the USB. Not yet. Instead, I asked, "Why apply here?" He looked down at his hands. "I heard the company does good work. I thought, maybe I could be part of that now." "And you think that makes up for what happened?" "No," he said. His voice was soft, almost ashamed. "I think it's too late to make up for it, but I don't know where else to go." I slid the USB across the table. He didn't pick it up, just stared at it like it was glowing. "I'm not here for revenge. Rylan," I said, "I built this place for people who had no one speaking for them, for people like me. And I'm one of the people you protect them from." "Yes," I said. He nodded, quietly. "I won't beg." He whispered, "You already did." I replied, standing, and I survived. And this time, I wasn't the one leaving the room in silence. He didn't say anything as he left the interview room, just walked out slowly, shoulders slumped, the door clicking softly behind him like punctuation on a sentence I had waited 4 years to write. I stood still for a moment, listening to the silence return, letting it stretch across the glass and steel and memory that filled this office. This place was mine now, every wall, every policy, every voice we fought to amplify. I had built this ground, brick by bloody brick, and he had come onto it as a stranger. When I sat back down, I didn't cry. I didn't tremble or gloat or feel vindicated. I felt weightless, like some part of me, some heavy, invisible thing that had sat inside my chest for years, had finally been lifted. It wasn't vengeance. It was closure. I slipped the USB back into the drawer beside the photo of my aunt, the one who'd told me when I was 12. "One day, they'll see what you're made of, but by then, you won't need them to." I had never believed her, until now. Later that afternoon, our hiring coordinator came to check in. Do we need to move forward with Rylan's file? She asked. No, I said firmly, looking her in the eye. He is not a fit for our culture. Let's thank him and close the loop. She nodded, not asking further. She didn't need to. The team knew my history only in shapes and shadows. They didn't know my name used to be different, or that the very foundation of our company came from something I barely survived. But they trusted me. That was enough. That evening, I stayed late again, not because I had work to finish, but because I needed the stillness. From the 17th floor, the city lights blurred into golden rivers through the windows. The glow reflected off the glass tabletop, catching the edge of the USB like it wanted to remind me, you're not done. And I wasn't, because a week later, a letter arrived. No return address. The handwriting was rushed, familiar, the kind that used to scrawl grocery lists and birthday cards signed with guilt instead of love. It was from my mother. We're losing the house. It said, Rylan can't find work. Your father's health is declining. We need help. You're still our daughter. I stared at it for a long time, not because I didn't expect it, but because I did. I expected exactly this. When they thought I was dying, they planned how to use me. When I lived, they erased me. And now that life had turned against them, they remembered I existed. Not for love, for rescue. I folded the letter slowly, then opened my laptop and wrote a single reply on a blank document. No embellishment, no anger. You chose your son when I was unconscious. Live with that. I printed it, signed it with my new name, and mailed it in a plain envelope. No return address. They'd know it was me. That same night, as the sky turned navy above the bay, I stood barefoot on the balcony of my small apartment, coffee in hand, the wind tugging gently at the corners of my cardigan. The city buzzed below alive, uncaring, indifferent. I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't spare. I wasn't waiting to be chosen. 2 days later, an internal email came across our leadership inbox. The local hospital where I had been treated, where my body had nearly been split open for someone else's convenience, was launching a new protocol. The Renner Ethics Initiative. It was named after me, a formal, binding policy that required double consent from at-risk patients in organ donation cases, especially minors and dependents. It was built on our white paper, the very one I had stayed up all night writing 2 years ago. But now, it had a name. My name. Not the one they gave me, but the one I had claimed for myself. I stared at the screen, hand frozen over my mouse. Then I exhaled. This was it. Not revenge. Not retribution. This was legacy. Later that week, I stopped by the courthouse to file the final paperwork unlinking me from the Quade estate entirely. No ties, no claims, no obligation. I was no longer the daughter of Margaret and Dean Quade. I was Calla Renner, founder, survivor, strategist, and advocate. As I left the building, I passed a woman holding her teenage daughter's hand, leaning in to whisper something gently, protectively. I watched them walk away, wondering briefly what that kind of bond might feel like. But I didn't ache for it anymore. I had spent too long trying to force myself into a role they never wanted me in. And now, in every room I walked into, I took up space fully, unapologetically. The following month, I received an invitation from a major policy summit. They were featuring women in medical justice, and they wanted me to speak about ethics, autonomy, and power. I accepted. And when I took that stage weeks later, in a hall full of policymakers and practitioners, I didn't talk about my past. I talked about the future, about the cost of silence, the architecture of coercion, and how institutions could either shield or shatter. I ended with one quiet sentence. Dignity, I said, is not something anyone can assign to you. It's something you reclaim. The applause that followed wasn't what healed me. It was the moment I stepped off that stage and realized I didn't need to win them back. I had already won myself. The applause faded, but the echo of my final words, dignity is not something anyone can assign to you. It's something you reclaim, stayed with me long after I stepped off that stage. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to see their faces or know who approved. The speech wasn't for them. It was for the girl who once lay silent in a hospital bed, stitched together and forgotten. That girl no longer needed saving. A week later, another letter came. The handwriting was shakier this time, as if rushed or written with trembling hands. My mother's voice filled the page, pleading, not angry. "We are losing the house. Rylan hasn't found steady work. Your father's heart isn't doing well. You're still our daughter." It didn't sting the way I thought it might. The words felt distant, like they belonged to a version of me that no longer existed. I sat at my desk for a long time, staring at the envelope. Then I reached for a pen, wrote one sentence, folded it, and mailed it without ceremony when I was dying. "You chose who should live. Now live with that." I didn't sign it with love. I didn't sign it at all. A month later, the hospital released the final version of the Renner Ethics Protocol. It was official, binding, and included a provision for legal review before any high-risk family consent was processed. My name stood at the top of the policy in bold, unshakable type. Not Calla Quade, not daughter of, just Calla Renner, architect of her own worth. I printed the policy and framed it in my office, not out of pride, but as proof. Not of what I had accomplished, but of what I had endured and still chose to build from. One evening, I returned home late from work. My apartment was quiet, a soft hum from the old fridge, the only sound in the room. I stepped out onto the small balcony, mug of tea in hand, and looked out at Commencement Bay. The water shimmered under a silver moon, rippling gently like it carried all the secrets I had once buried. It hit me, not suddenly, but like a slow realization unfurling in my chest. I had survived every attempt to erase me. Not just the surgeries, not just the betrayal, but the subtle, daily erasures, the ignored report cards, the deflected praise, the way my mother looked through me like I was fog on the glass. They hadn't just taken organs or money. They had tried to take my narrative, and I took it back, not through revenge, not through confrontation, but through ownership, brick by quiet brick. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I wasn't hoping for reconciliation. I had found peace in the only place it ever truly existed within the boundaries I now held firm. I didn't have to justify them anymore. Not to family, not to the past, not even to myself. Some nights, I still dreamt of the hospital, the sterile smell, the muffled voices, the feeling of being watched without being seen. But those dreams didn't haunt me anymore. They reminded me of how far I had come and how deeply I had rooted. That weekend, I walked to the dock near the bay at sunrise, wearing the same coat I had the day I left the hospital. The wind was colder now, but I didn't flinch. I sat on the edge of the wood and pulled the silver locket from my pocket, the only thing I had kept from my life before. Inside was a tiny photo of my aunt, her smile soft, her eyes steady. "I'm okay," I whispered. "You were right. I didn't need them to see me. I just needed to see myself." I stayed there until the sun began to crest over the horizon, lighting the water with a golden shimmer. When I stood, I didn't hesitate. I placed the locket back in my coat and walked home, each step quiet but certain. There was nothing left to prove, no one left to convince. And still I was here. I don't carry bitterness. I carry truth. And truth has never needed to scream. I've learned that your value is not measured by who embraces you or who claims you as theirs. It's measured by who you choose to be when no one is watching, when no one is clapping, when you stand alone. They once saw me as an extra piece, a burden, a body to use, then discard. But I am none of those things. I am not their shadow. I am not their mistake. I am not their apology. I am the result of every quiet step I took in the other direction. I no longer walk to be seen. I walk because the ground beneath me is mine. As I close my front door behind me, locking it with my own key, I glance one last time at the framed policy on the wall. Renner Ethics Protocol. I exhale slowly, setting down my bag, and I smile, not because I need validation, but because I know my worth was never theirs to define, and dignity cannot be taken. It can only be owned.